very often verse 29 onwards have been used by those who do hold a very sort of Calvinistic predestination kind of view that really we've got nothing to do with it, it's all God and so on. Because obviously, again, in many of the older translations, here in the NRSV, it puts it this way: for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, and so on. And those whom he predestined, he also called. I mean, I think that the word predestined is often doing a lot of work there, because people assume, oh, that just means there was no role. God's sort of making it all happen. He's chosen who's going to be in, who's going to be out, who's doing what, who's not doing what. What are we misunderstanding with that way of looking at it?
Okay, what we're misunderstanding yet one more time is the Old Testament background and context. And when I was working through that passage a couple of years ago, for the umpteenth time, but doing it again, I was very struck by the direct echo there of the Greek version of Isaiah and the servant songs in Isaiah particularly, where the servant is Israel, who is called to a task in the purposes of God, and the servant is justified and glorified. And Isaiah is not talking about going to heaven when you die, and he's not talking about God selecting some individuals to go to heaven and telling others, too bad, the deal's already done. It's about the call of the servant people to be God's agents in bringing about his new creation. And the whole theme of new creation is, of course, Isaiah 40 to 55 in a nutshell. New creation through the work of the servant. And then it's noticeable that in verses 31 following of Romans 8, Paul immediately goes back to the servant songs where he's tracking with, it is God who justifies, who shall condemn, etc., etc. So he's got Isaiah 40 to 55 in his head all the way through. And the problem with, as you say, the word predestined is that we've got 4 centuries of Calvin and so on in our heads. And before that, actually, Augustine and Aquinas, Calvin didn't invent these interpretations. And part of the problem then, all the way back to Augustine and Aquinas, is that they've screened out the whole Old Testament story of God's purposes for Israel, failing to realize that those are the purposes which are fulfilled in Jesus. And it's for the benefit of the world, not to rescue people away from the world. So we really need a better translation than the predestined one, which is why I've translated it, those he marked out. I think that's what I've said at that point.
That's right, yes.
Marked out, he called. And there we get this strange picture, which is not here telling us exactly, as it were, who's in, who's out. I'm not a universalist. I do believe it's possible for humans to say no to God. But I don't think that's what this verse is about, some people being in and some people being out. It's that if you're grasped by the love of God in Christ, if the Spirit is stirring in your heart, then you have a calling, and you have a calling which involves you being then vindicated and glorified in the sense of, through your agonizing in prayer, being set in this strange, glorious authority over the world, and thereby sharing the extraordinary mission of the Son, who comes to his glorification precisely on the cross. So that it's the whole thing is saying to Christians who are suffering or who are about to suffer, this is actually not just something you've got to get through, but it's part of the strange means by which, as with the death of Jesus himself, God is actually redeeming the world, which is, of course, both an encouragement and, in a way, a warning. But it really isn't about the issues that the great Reformation tradition has made it about.
Yes, you frequently reminded us of that so helpfully, and I think so many Christians have found a sort of finding this original sort of way of understanding Paul's words, freeing it from, as you say, those Reformation concerns. It's helped to sort of enliven our role in God's big story. It sort of stops it being about just this vertical, oh, this is just something that tells me how to make sure I get into heaven. It becomes about us being part of a much bigger cosmic story. And I find, and when you read it in that light, everything that Paul says in Romans 8 about the groaning of creation and those being set free from bondage to decay, it makes so much more sense that we're part of a bigger story in which we are participating with God in this.
Yeah. Exactly.